Well, good morning. I'm glad to be here with you today. And here's a quote from Thomas Merton for you. Pride makes us artificial, and humility makes us real. When we think about a topic and we think we know everything about it, we think we've really studied it and we've become experts, we can get all puffed up over that. When we do, when we think we know it all, we tend to overlook valuable new information that comes along. We become blind to amazing new vistas that can be opened before us and to opportunities that God is putting in our path. Also, getting that sense of pride, becoming artificial, can lead to endless destructive arguments when two people feel the same way, when they're both prideful and think they know it all. It's best to remain forever students, forever humble enough to admit that we need to know more. Jesus is reminding us of that today. Now, there was trouble back in Jesus' day. Jesus' followers were starting to take on airs, like the Pharisees and the scribes. And Jesus is calling this crowd to listen to him and to repent, to turn their lives around, to change their ways, to go away from that prideful artificiality and move instead towards a humble humanity, to quote from Thomas Merton there. Jesus calls all his hearers away from the tendency not to practice what we preach, not to have aggression towards our students. Jesus wants us to not to allow our heads to be turned by flattery and prestige, not to chase after prestige, not to judge others harshly and to block their way towards spiritual growth. Jesus warns us against weighing people down with excessive rules and regulations that somehow allow us to avoid being burdened by those same rules and regulations. Jesus calls us to share the load. Jesus wants us to avoid tricky wordplay. Jesus wants us to avoid really shallow spirituality. You know, a nice, pretty-looking veneer over basically really cheap pressboard. We don't want to be like that. Jesus wants us to avoid posturing, wanting the best seat at the table, the best place in the restaurant. And Jesus wants us to avoid being resistance because of pride to the divine wisdom, especially when the word that is divine seems to threaten our own power and prestige. All of these things Jesus is calling Christians away from. Jesus even tells his followers that you should follow what the scribes and the Pharisees say because they're correctly pointing toward God's law. But don't fall into the mistake of pride and do what they do, but do what they say. It's a daunting challenge, and it takes a great deal of humility to hear it and take it to heart, because some of those things listed are things that are habits for all of us. One of the troubles we have today is that we want to see this as an old argument between Jesus and the religious leaders, not something that will impact us. We want to be like that gif of the person who is eagerly eating popcorn and avidly watching the fireworks go off, the entertainment from afar that has no connection to us as some chaos is taking place. And if we do that, if we act like that, we are totally missing the point of Matthew. In verse 8, Jesus changed the discussion. Up to then, people might have been comfy because this seemed to be a comparison between Jesus and the leaders of Israel, but suddenly the discussion becomes about you instead of them. And it becomes all about Christians, all about us, not about the religious leaders of long ago. And Jesus is calling us to be ready for lifelong learning, to never set learning aside, to never call ourselves experts and feel that we can replace humility with pride because now we know everything or we know enough. And we have done enough and we can rest on our laurels. No. The Pharisees contended that your primary duty was to learn the law, and they placed that over doing the law. But it's a mistaken notion to think that they didn't emphasize doing at all. You had to know it so that you could do it. But a lot of people got hung up on the knowing and just memorizing and quoting and felt that was enough. But it wasn't enough for the Pharisees, and it wasn't enough for Jesus, and it's not enough for us. So what do we do instead? How do we avoid this mistake of pride? Well, we avoid the mess that pride creates by remaining students mentally, keeping humility front and center in our lives. Also, Jesus called his hearers and his followers to be servant leaders like him and not pompous leaders. Don't get yourself all puffed up with titles, don't seek after those, but instead spend your energies acting out Jesus' teachings. Always practice what we preach. Always be willing to roll up the sleeves and work alongside everybody else. Not directing other people from afar, not being armchair quarterbacks or sidewalk supervisors for Jesus, but actually getting into the fray. We should never burden others with excessive rules and regulations that harm them but benefit ourselves, curiously. If we do that, if we do create those rules and regulations that harm them and make it easy for us, all we end up doing is creating an enormous gap between us and them, between leaders and their people. And it alienates both groups. It sets ourselves up on pedestals where the temptation will be to look down on those who are trying to follow the rules and regulations that we've set, especially those really burdensome ones, and to think less of them. We need to be humble students instead, and that means that we don't make a big deal out of our leadership. We don't wear fancy dress like the Pharisees with their extended robe fringes and all the rest, so that people will look at us and notice us and call us by title out in public. We want our deeds to be noticed, not ourselves. And those deeds need to be pointing to Jesus and to Jesus' way of doing things, not to ourselves. We need to resist the temptation to draw and enjoy the attention that we draw to ourselves. We have to avoid looking for perks for ourselves, special seats at the gatherings for ourselves. This was particularly a big deal back in Jesus' day. We don't collect a bunch of titles. That leads to a certain level of pride and artificiality. Instead, we need to be students among students. Jesus is our teacher, and we need to stay humble. And when we do consider ourselves students among students, that's one way of doing so. That's one way of remaining humble at all times and not setting ourselves up for power, but keeping all of us equal as children of God. And the greatness that is sought comes from service, humility, maintaining integrity, and avoiding puffery. Those are the people who will be exalted in God's world, those who remain humble. We cannot be detached critics of others, whether they're leadership or the rest of humanity. We need to be able to get in there and get our hands dirty. To maintain a right relationship with God and humanity, providing leadership that points to Jesus as our source of authority, as our teacher, and that keeps us all of us Christians, humble students of Christ. In the end, we will reflect God's love for humanity to all of humanity if we do the work properly. We need to work for God's justice and mercy for everyone. And that's what this meant for the Christians of Jesus' day. But what does it mean for us today? Well, what Jesus had to say still fully applies to us. Because when Jesus says you, that is every you of every age that has ever been or ever will be. It's a very all-encompassing you. There's no sitting back. There's no eating popcorn and passively watching as things get crazy. Nope. For us, what we say we believe must be reflected in all that we do. We have to help others to be in right relationship with God and with humanity. And that ends up putting us in right relationship with God and humanity. How neatly that all works out. So we need to remember that we are forever students. We will never know all there is to know in the world or even in our own little corner of the world. And when we believe that, we stay humble and we learn. And we make humility a habit because we have to, because humility, being humble, is not a default setting of a person. It's something that has to become a habit. It has to be worked at until it becomes part of everyday life. We need to keep servant leadership that Jesus showed for us as the gold standard that we're working toward. As much as we want to come into God's presence, we live for God's world reborn. We must want that for everyone else as well. We need to live lives that are simple and sincere. We need to be that cool drink of water on a hot and crazy day. Justice, mercy, and loyalty need to be our watchwords. The words that we live by, that guide how we approach others, what organizations we will support, what people we will back. We need to seek to be generous with others, including in simple things, tipping servers, smiling at strangers with our eyes because we're wearing masks, but still saying hello. Or the other day at the SPCA Medical Center, we needed to take Monroe back in because he had a case of kennel cough that was undetected when we first picked him up, but showed up a couple days later. Went there, was waiting for our turn outside in the car, and there was this young lady trying to get a boxer into the medical center. It was their turn for the appointment, and this boxer was big enough and strong enough, he was almost pulling her off her feet. He'd been there before and had no interest in going back in. So I called out to her and asked her, "Can I help you?" And at first she said, "I don't think so." But then she scooped up the boxer, she had to pick him up off his feet, and she got to the door and she said, "Could you open the door for me?" Sure, absolutely, I was delighted to help. Simple little things like that can make a big difference in somebody's day. We need to keep our eyes and ears open for the voice of God as well. It can come to us in so many ways, including words from others, the beauty of the natural world around us, and we need to be ready to respond. Years ago, I was looking for a job, and everything seemed to have gone well. The interview was fantastic, and I felt really good about it, and then I didn't get the job. And I prayed for it that night, rather pointedly, asking, what went wrong? What's going on, God? Where are you leading? And the very next day at church, a mentor of mine walked up to me and said, I hear you didn't get the job. Now let me tell you why that's a good thing. And God answered me through my friend and mentor very directly. And because I had the ears to hear, I heard and appreciated that quick response. I want you to listen to Fred Rogers now. Fred Rogers, the minister and host of a very familiar children's television show on PBS. And this is one thing he had to say. Evil wants us to feel so terrible about who we are and who we know that we'll look with condemning eyes on anyone who happens to be with us at the moment. I encourage you to look for the good where you are and to embrace it. Fred Rogers calls us to humility, just like Jesus calls us to humility. I've been getting a whole lot of education on Zoom lately. I've been the humble student, and on YouTube instructional videos so that I can keep learning about how to do live streaming and how we can all survive the pandemic. And last week, there was a Philadelphia Baptist Association meeting with Dr. Thomas Farley, who is the health commissioner for Philadelphia. And we were talking about the rise of COVID-19 in the coming months, and I want you to listen to what God has to say through Dr. Farley now. The fall and the winter spike in COVID-19 is going to be very serious. Right now we're down in Philadelphia to about 10 deaths a week, down from 200 in the spring. But Dr. Farley warns that if we don't do anything to help, that in the coming months, the rate of deaths per week will rise to 200 to 300 per week if we do nothing. And it's going to hit every community. No one will be left out, but it's going to hit the African American community hardest. There are things we can do to help prevent this awful prediction, this awful increase from coming true. And it's the same simple things we've been told before. We need to wear our masks. Whenever we're around someone that we don't live in the same house with, we need to wear a mask, whether it's inside or outside. We need to be washing our hands. We need to discourage gatherings until we're past the dangerous January and February peaks. And that's going to be really hard because we've got Thanksgiving and Christmas coming up, times when we really want to get together. And that's to be discouraged, but if we do get together, we need to be safe. We need to be as safe as we can be. Now, we need to discourage weddings and funerals for now. And he emphasized that churches that are meeting together need to go back to doing online worship like we're doing here, because that's the safest for the next few months. This is how we get to save lives. This is how we get to show love for neighbor. This is how we get to live out our faith as Jesus is calling us to do. This is how we be humble students and humble servants, ever learning and ever serving others, so that we can build a better future together in the here and now. We are called to be humble students for the rest of our lives, learning always from Jesus, listening to God's words that can come to us through others, and we need to be eager to take in the divine wisdom and put it to use when it comes to us. We are called to be real and not to be artificial. We are called to be servant leaders, to roll up our sleeves, to work side by side with others working together, making the load lighter for everyone, and not making things easy on ourselves. If we do that, we will live better lives together and will live in the joy of God, bringing a bit of God's world into our world in the here and now. What could possibly be better? Let's pause for a moment of silent reflection. Amen.